Hello and welcome. Before we get started, let's be sure everyone is able to select their language channel. Saludos y bienvenidos. Antes de comenzar, vamos a asegurarnos que todos pueden conectarse en su canal de su idioma. The options available for this session are English, Spanish, or original audio if you would like to hear the audio without interpretation. Las opciones que tenemos para esta sesión son inglés, español y audio original si quisiera oír el audio sin interpretación. For people connecting through a computer, you can choose your language channel by clicking on the interpretation icon to the bottom left that looks like a globe. Para la gente que se están uniendo por computadora, pueden elegir su idioma en haciendo clic en el icono que está abajo en la parte inferior de la pantalla a la izquierda. Parece un globo. For people connecting with a mobile device, you can choose your language channel by selecting the More option, then Interpretation, then select your language from the available options. Para los usuarios móviles, pueden elegir su idioma en seleccionar donde dice More o Más y entonces seleccionar donde dice Interpretación o Interpretation y entonces seleccionar su idioma. With much gratitude to our interpreters today, Claudia, Travis, and Jackie. We're so grateful for you. We also have live captioning available that can be accessed by clicking on the multimedia viewer box on the right of your screen. Now we will begin. Hello and thank you for joining us today for the second session in our 5-part series, Culturally Rooted Traditions and Healing and Resistance. I'm Gabriela Zapata Alma. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the Associate Director with the National Center. It is my pleasure to open our session today. First, we'll go over some technical details of the WebEx software. Your screen may look slightly different depending on the kind of device that you're using. Throughout the session, we welcome your thoughts, questions, and resources. The chat box can be found at the bottom right of your screen. You may have to click on the chat icon that looks like a speech bubble to open it. Let's test that chat feature now. Please introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from today. Thanks so much, everyone. If you get disconnected at any point, please re-enter the session using the original webinar link that was emailed to you. Sometimes the sound cuts out because of an internet connection. Feel free to call back in if the sound is unclear at any time. If you're experiencing technical difficulties, you can directly chat Carla Alegría, project manager with our center, for assistance. If you are unable to contact Carla, please reach out to WebEx Tech Support. Carla will post that phone number in the chat box. And please feel free to share your questions throughout the session for our question and answer session at the end. Now to introduce our speakers. Joining us today, we are thrilled to have Shaniqua Ford, LCSW, lead therapist and wellness coach at Soulwork Cafe, LLC, and Dr. Yvette Flores, professor of Chicano Studies at the University of California, Davis, as well as past president, Section 3 Interest of Hispanics and Latinas, Division 35, Women in Psychology of the American Psychological Association, as well as president, Division 27, Society for Community Research and Action of the American Psychological Association. For more information, please check out their bios in the webinar announcement. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I'd like to take a moment to open our space with a poem by Nayyirah Waheed from her book Salt. I am your friend, a soul for your soul, a place for your life. Know this, sun or water, here or away, we are a lighthouse. We leave and we stay. Lighthouse. So with that, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today, and I will now welcome Shaniqua to the virtual stage.
Try this again. Hello, hello, all. It is a pleasure to be here and be able to hold space with you all. I'm grateful for Gabriella, who has offered me the space. I'm grateful just to be here. I am the lead therapist and the founder of Soul Work Cafe, where I've created ideally a decolonized mental health practice that is focused on strengthening communities through psychoeducation, through one-on-one and group therapy, but also through interdependence. This is what we'll be talking about today. Um, so, in this, our wellness practice is rooted in healing justice, of course, following evidence based practice, but we make ensure that we have racial and cultural responsive frameworks. And some of the inspiration for our practice comes from um, scholars, folks with lived experience who has been in this longer than us. And I would love to share a quote with you all that speaks to what soul work is and why it is a communal practice. Um, this quote is from Dr. Nicholas Cooper, and it states, "We who are soul therapists will always be tempted to dilute the bitter cup of challenge and change so that it is palatable to the community we love. But we can be encouraged that in an indigenous tradition is coming down to us from the most courageous of our early forebears, soul therapists, who did not simply cope with the immensity of grief among our people, but who helped our community to process and overcome grief." Again, one of our pillars at Soul Work Cafe is community. Now, what is different for us in the private practice space is that we are communal focused. When we meet folks on their healing journey, and for folks come to allow us to witness them and walk with them on their journey, part of our initial frameworks includes a community care plan. Because when we talk about being rooted culturally, we're talking about being in community and not being silos and healing in silos. At Soul Work, like I said, we what we call mainstream mental health, we'll call a treatment plan. We create a plan and a healing journey, which includes a community care plan. That means when you cross the threshold to say, yes, I am at a place of change and I need more, then we begin to talk about who is around you that will support this journey with you. Who do you feel safe with? And sometimes the answer or the conversation really being had is, who do we feel safe enough with? Understanding that everything, every part of ourselves is connected to something else, right? So as we begin to heal, we begin to shift everything we're connected to, and ideally healing all the parts of ourselves, people, places, and things that we're also connected to. So we begin that conversation and we make it a priority to let known that, like, I myself or any of the other therapists are just one resource within a global community that our clients have access to. And this has been one of the most remarkable tools I've used thus far. In my history in community mental health, one of the things I noticed and why I wanted to do my practice differently is that folks who would come in with dis-ease, psychological and emotional, often it was exacerbated by a lack of connection. There were broken family ties and strained relationships, but even further reaching community relationships were strained. And folks didn't feel safe in their own communities, let alone their families. So there was a lot of work that I felt called to specifically to help folks address the emotional and psychological dis-ease through connection and relationship building. One of my favorite tools to use also is a method that came out of the restorative justice world, and that's called pod mapping, where we're able to identify what the individual feels they need, but then to go a step further and say, well, who's in the immediate family? Who is of support and a good, healthy connection? After we've done that work, and sometimes simultaneously, we also look at what is right outside that immediate family, right? Which looks like faith traditions, communities and churches, and then even one step further, institutions that is maybe it's a point to talk about. There are some that are out here doing some good work, right? Like the space we're in now with the network, the national network. So thinking about helping folks build their web of resources. And it's not that they don't have it. Sometimes we just need community to remember that we are interwoven and that we are because they are. So this is the work that we're doing currently. Again, when we think about culturally rooted traditions, other ways in which soul work, myself and the other therapists in our practice, works to reemphasize culturally rooted healing practice are allowing space for all of the beautiful ways that our folks show up and holding them in comfort and honor and respect in those places. So that means all the non dominant narratives and faith traditions and experiences, allowing space to show up in holding, not solving, not fixing, right? And not stigmatizing, of course. And these are the culturally rooted practices. Those that look like breaking bread. So traditional therapy often have folks in an office, four walls. It might be a very nice office, but understanding that for some folks that is a trigger. Some folks need to process trauma and difficult emotions by walking. So what does it look like to be able to meet um, your therapist or guide or accompaniment on the trail and walk through as we process and talk? The other piece is thinking about breaking bread. Oftentimes in our healing process, it can become so sterile, right? This is the medical model. But when we start talking about cultural traditions, that's the reason we named our practice Soul Work Cafe. We wanted to build a place where eventually, though we're totally virtual right now, we can break bread and we can talk because that allows connection and bond. So these are the within my own culture ways in which um, culturally rooted practices such as breaking bread, such as being in nature, allow folks to heal and to walk their journey, right? With support and with community. The other ways also is using group work. Currently, there is a increase in practice around just building community, building silence, right? And so one of our faith, my old faith traditions that I still like to practice and that clients feel that is very cathartic is actually wailing sessions. Being able to move through that difficult emotion and energy through wailing, through crying out, through song. Traditionally, and the Black church, this is one of those cathartic experiences that kept folks in upbeat moods, right? We could go lay it all at the altar and trust and believe that it was well. So we think about how can we integrate these ways that have allowed folks to continue to be resilient and to survive, and then offer them space to be brought into um, a an evolution where they can also be used to thrive, right? To familiarize, all while building an interdependence because again, we cannot heal in a silo. So I know that may have been a lot, a lot of words. Um, but those are the ways in which we feel the importance of community and healing and culturally rooted practices work together, of course, in folks' healing journey. And at this time, I want to offer it back to Gabriella.
Thank you so much, Shaniqua. Just
Yeah.
really, really caring in my heart how you talk about that we don't heal in silos, that so much of this is um, remembering our interconnectedness, who is safe or at least safe enough, and how that can evolve as we go through our journey. And I love the example that you offer of whaling. It's so incredibly important, especially many times in a society where we're in so many different spaces told to stay still and be quiet. Right. So with that, I will now open the virtual stage to La Doctora Yvette.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you, Carla, and thank you, Shaniqua, for those beautiful words. I'm a little under the weather, so I hope I don't have a major coughing fit, but please bear with me if I do. Inspired by your words, Shaniqua, I want to foreground a bit the work that I do as an educator. I've been trained as a community clinical psychologist since 1982. So I've been in the field for a long time and being raised and trained as a traditional psychologist, I never felt that I fit. And I was literally considering leaving a university job that I had to go work retail or flip burgers. I'm working class background. I can do many things. I'm not afraid of work. I didn't grow up with privilege, so I didn't quite understand the weight and the value that a PhD held. When I was approached by a dear colleague to apply for a position at UC Davis in Chicana and Chicano Studies, and I thought, what is a psychologist going to do in Chicano Studies? Chicano studies historically had been very anti-psychology for very good reasons, namely the use of psychological testing to diagnose children as developmentally delayed who were not, they were bilingual or Spanish dominant, by tracking students out of academic spaces. And my colleague said, we're different. We're women, we're feminists, and we believe in your idea of psychology, which was, before we had coined the term, decolonial. I really felt and believed and practiced psychology rooted in the experiences of people, not in dominant paradigms that came from Europe. My life work has been with individuals from the global south. As far as Latinx communities, we are very diverse. By definition, Latinx are multiracial. Not all of us may acknowledge it, not all of us look it. By looking at me, you certainly do not know my genealogy. I happen to look like the European immigrants who came to Latin America and not like the others who came or were brought. And as a result, we have to understand the impact of racism and internalized racism on our psyches, in addition to the history of colonization and the ways in which historically efforts were made systematically to separate us from spirit, to separate us from our cultural traditions, from our practices. If we can use Mexico as a metaphor, the temples were destroyed and churches were built atop the temples. There was not an effort to incorporate or integrate. There was instead an effort to destroy and annihilate. Yet, these beliefs and these traditions survived and are practiced to these days. In working with students, I see my role in helping them understand their history, reconnect to their ancestral roots, because particularly for those who are first generation, being in higher education can be a very alienating, marginalizing, soul-killing experience. My colleagues and I have tried to create a space in our department where students can thrive, where they can learn, where they can get in touch with who they are, with their potential, and to grow into the people they are meant to grow. And to do that, we have to look back. We have to look at the resilience and the strength that our ancestors give us. In the Mayan cosmology, we look 7 generations behind and 7 generations forward. It is up to us now to make the changes that are necessary so that the next 7 generations will have a greater quality of life, will be more grounded, will be more rooted in positivity, will be able to heal from the historical and intergenerational trauma. So, in my role as an educator, I see myself as a clinician who teaches and a teacher who supports the mental health of students. During the past 2.5 years of the pandemic, we were really challenged to continue to provide support for our students because we have community spaces in our department where we have food, where we have an opportunity for students to rest, take a nap, where we have computers for those who cannot afford to buy a laptop, where we have printers so they can print their work. And so during the pandemic, we were very concerned about how our students were going to navigate the educational experience. The majority of our students returned to their communities, and being the children of essential workers, they also went to work. And one of our students says to us, I cannot do classes synchronously because there are too many people in my house. I began to record the lectures. And he would tell me I have to sit in the closet at night to look at the lectures in order to be able to do my work. Because during the day, my younger siblings are connected and I have to support them and help them with their education. His parents did not speak English. To me, this is the embodiment of resilience because that student managed to do the work and pull all A's. I don't know that I could have. But I found that one of the things that helped me when I would go into my moments of pity party because I couldn't leave my house, because I couldn't do all the traveling I was planning to do, was to remember my children's paternal grandmother, who lost all by her young son during the pandemic of 1918. And she walked from Camargo, Tamaulipas, Mexico, crossed the Rio Grande, came into Texas, and started life again in Galveston with a third-grade education and a 9-year-old son. And I would think of Maria Hernandez and I would say, help me, guide me, inspire me. because I had grandchildren at home attending school, and a daughter who is a nurse who was leaving the house, a son in law who was also working outside the house. And we got through it, and we're getting through it, and we're still getting through it. And we have so much collective grief from all we lost and all whom we lost that at the present time, it is absolutely critical for us to reconnect to whatever our traditions are for processing grief. I love the idea of wailing. I really do. And one of the things that Latinx are known for, especially Caribbean people, who I am, is that we use humor to deal with grief. And it may appear very inappropriate to others because at funerals, we have wakes and people eat and drink and laugh and tell jokes. And that's a way to honor and celebrate those whose life touched ours. And so, in working with clients and in working with students, I invite them to think about how does your family honor the past? How does your family face the challenges of the present? And what of that do you want to carry forward? And do you want to share with others? I've adopted many traditions from Mexico because I spent many years working and living there. We celebrate Day of the Dead in my house. And one of the things that was truly fascinating to me is when my granddaughters were smaller, I had never talked to them about Day of the Dead because it's not in their Honduran father's family or my Chicana daughter's paternal side of the family. Is that I said to my granddaughters, who were 7 and 9 at the time, why don't we do an altar to honor our family members and friends who have passed on? And the girls said, sounds like a great idea. And as I started to sketch how we were going to do this and that we needed to have the 7 levels and all of the correct quote unquote things that we should have at the altar, they went away. And when I rejoined them, they already had built an altar. And I stood in awe and I said, where did you learn to make these? Did you read about this in school? And they said, no. I said, how did you know how to put together an altar? And they said, and the older touched her heart and she said, we asked grandma, my mother who passed away when she was 2 years old. We just thought about it. We thought, what would our ancestors and our friends who are no longer with us like to see? And they had built an amazing 7 level altar in the tradition of many communities in Mexico. And I knew then, again, what I've always known, that sometimes all we have to do is go inside, be quiet, and listen. Because the ancestors will speak to us, the ancestors will guide us. When I think about immigrants and refugees, who are a large segment of the population with whom I work, the trauma that they're bringing, the grief that they're carrying, and the resilience of survival to navigate those journeys, I see my moral, ethical obligation to prepare this generation of students to be part of those receiving communities that will help and support the adjustment of these new arrivals because they will need us. We heal in community, as Shaniqua has said. We do not heal by ourselves. And we are all part of those healing communities if we allow ourselves to be. I am so honored to have had the space with you. And my final comments would be for us to remember that we all have healing traditions. We may be somewhat separated from them, but we have them. And again, sometimes we just have to mindfully think, feel, and remember. And as we remember, we put together the separate bodies, the separate parts of our bodies, of our histories, of our knowledges. And this will guide us to be the allies, to be the community members that strive for social justice and that work across divisions of gender, ethnicity, race, class, sexuality, you name it, nationality, to create a better world for our children, for our grandchildren, and for the generations to come. I thank you.
Thank you so much. I love the story with your grandchildren and El Altar, and it's so true. We sometimes overthink things or come to explain it in a way where children who many times can be so much closer to spirit will go, okay, and then just intuitively connect to it. And then all the things that happen along the way that sometimes put up barriers in that intuitive connection, including sometimes the ways that we are taught to learn, the ways that we are supposed to learn. And so the piece there around we all have healing traditions, and being able to connect with that inner voice, with that inner experience, and connect with the guidance from those who came before us. Thank you. So I now want to open it up. I want to invite Shaniqua back to the virtual stage and then open it up for our question and answer. We have time for a conversation here. And while folks start to think of their questions and put them in the chat, I want to also open the floor to Shaniqua. Anything that kind of came up for you and moved you as you were listening?
Absolutely. I appreciate everything that was said because goodness, I not being so far removed from higher ed and my training journey and educational journey, um, to have a a mentor, a teacher, a professor such as you would have been so amazing. In addition, I lucked out. I found a great couple of folks on my team that helps with the decolonization work, but to have that information, to have that accessible and to have that permission to tap into these things as a student going through programs and in community would have been, I think, a even another, just, yeah, enriching experience. So I'm grateful for all of the work that you do. This conversation is just giving me so much joy as a private practice owner and as a member of the community who wants to do things differently and wants to help folks remember, right? So I'm just full. I don't know that I have much more to say. I'm just grateful to be in this space and to have all the things Spirit has been sharing and Life's Journey has been sharing affirmed. So I'm grateful for you all.
Thank you, Shaniqua. And when you were talking about the cafe, and I think that, sometimes we do things because it's customary, it's our tradition. So
Mm.
when our department was in an army barracks, abandoned army barracks on our campus for years, and it took about 25 years for us to actually be able to move into a building. And so the committee that was negotiating our space had to fight to have more than just faculty offices because we
Mm.
felt that we absolutely had to have a student office and we had to have a large conference room and we had to have a library and we had to have um, a space where we could have a refrigerator, a microwave, and storage facility for food. And the university folks could not quite understand why that was the case. And we said, because we eat and we share meals and we provide food for our students. And they said, but why do you have to provide food for our students? So we went ahead and did a survey and found that 2/3 of our students had food insecurity. And now this is something that the university routinely does, but we did this back in 1993. And we've been able to hold on to those spaces, even though they're always trying to get us to give up the space. But it was a cultural thing, right? Second nature to us. And I think this is part of what also needs to be theorized in the decolonial process is that we have to create institutional spaces that resonate with the cultural backgrounds of the people who inhabit those spaces because our students are not the same students that were at UC Davis in the 1950s or even 60s. And we still have a long way to go. And absolutely, healing centers
Mhm.
have to have spaces where we can break bread in community.
Mhm.
It's amazing because this concept, um, even in my practice and thinking about bringing on folks to work in community in collaboration with me in practice, this is one of those mindsets that has to be unlearned. So folks
Mhm.
come in and they're used to coming in from, higher ed where there's a hierarchy, corporate where there's a hierarchy, and then we meet and say like, no, we are our mission. And so we're breaking bread. How can I support you? What is it that you need? Productivity is one thing, and yes, bills have to be paid, but you as a human who offer your genius and your spirit here, what is it? How can we heal together? What is it that we all have need of? And I think it's been interesting for me to realize that that is also the work, right? Reestablishing um, a communal and a tribe versus this hierarchy of
Mhm.
power, right?
Yeah.
Um, because it
Mhm.
can happen. We don't have to, submit ourselves and conform to this capitalistic and white supremacist process of doing everything.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'd
And
love
we
to have a longer conversation with you all about this because that's what I'm trying to do at APA, and it's quite an adventure.
And we have a question that I think just weaves really beautifully into the current conversation as well. And so the person who's asking the question is a clinical social worker, but I think we can say that this applies across kind of professions where there's licensure or certification, and people are being held to what's considered quote unquote best practice or quote unquote evidence based when what is centered as evidence-based or best practice is specifically Eurocentric
Mhm.
or isn't necessarily culturally specific or culturally responsive.
hmm I think one
Oh,
to
sorry. So
start.
that was my like, that was my intro. I'm talking a lot. That was my introduction to the question. Now I'm going to ask the question. How do we as clinicians, and I would extend that to, advocates and all kinds of folks as well, how do we invite and encourage exploration and incorporation of non-Western healing practices within the confines of our licensure? It's a struggle at times balancing what's intuitive and necessary with all the legal stuff tied to licenses.
Yeah, so for me, I'm actually excited to answer this one because I feel like we intentionally attempt to do this. I think first and foremost, we start by telling the truth that a lot of these evidence-based practices were gleaned from ancestral and indigenous practices that were already in practice centuries ago and that were maladapted to, house this other place. So if we begin to tell the truth and really ask questions about the work we're doing and really name the thing, I think you would find that a lot of the evidence-based practices that you may already be intuitively engaging in, they have a name, right? And Western psychology, social work, clinical practice will give them a name, but they're they're in line. So I challenge myself with really thinking about some of these practices like CBT, and when thinking about reframing our thought, what is that centered in, right? When we talk about doing core beliefs and values assessments, what are you really talking about? You're asking someone to go inward and really build up self awareness and attunement with self and their environment. So I think it's really a naming the thing and being honest about where it came from, but also finding creative ways. There are more practices out here like somatic attachment therapy. It's focused on being in your body, doing body work, and be able to name it. Just because we have now got it credentialed in certain spaces doesn't mean it was ever irrelevant. These
Yeah.
practices are important and we can weave them in and understand them by using the necessary language, of course. But, and I'm speaking more in terms of like uh, integrating and building that bridge of where we feel like it's a dichotomy. It's really getting ourselves to understand that actually it all exists. We just have to find the name for it over here, even though we've been doing it here. I hope that makes sense. That's just my input.
Hmm. Hmm. And I would like to add that I'll shade to everything you said. I would like to add that this is where the resistance piece also comes in. There are a few of us now in the field that have infiltrated important spaces like psychology and psychiatry and social work that um, do research and write books. And I'm thinking of the work of Celia Falico, for example, multicultural supervision, um, Guillermo Bernal and others, um, how to do therapy cross culturally. And they're using all of the Western nomenclature, but they're really talking about what we do, being present, um, being honest, telling the truth, and that I see those of us in between these spaces are really, really being the bridges and being the translators, being the interpreters. Also, you're talking about susto, soul loss. Well, over here they call it PTSD. So I'm going to ask you some questions about how it's viewed over here, but then, I want to hear the story from you as to how you think this happened, and then we can get your soul back. We can get the community together to bring back your soul. But we're going to have to put down PTSD on that form, right? So that you can get the insurance to pay for this. And I think this is the power of actually being able to navigate both worlds for those of us who are privileged enough to have had the education to do so. As long as we don't forget who we are and what we really believe, we can straddle those worlds and assign these books to students and do the supervision that really informs and guides the next generation of practitioners.
Thank you. Yes. And then I have a question. Um, so, for our advocates who are here in the room with us in the virtual space, and what are some ways that as you've talked about different cultural resources and the importance of community, some ways that our advocates can apply some of this information as they're supporting survivors who may be in crisis at this time.
You want to go first? Well, I think the concept of acompañamiento, of walking with, is really important. Um, to be present, because sometimes that's all we need is somebody who believes us, who is not asking questions about what we did to cause this, but who is there holding us, holding our psychic space, taking care of sometimes of our basic needs. Have you had water today? Have you eaten today? Do you have a ride? Do you want me to go with you? Do you need to fill out paperwork? I mean, those simple details that are so rich and so important, that can fill in and reconnect us with our humanity, and that reminds us when evil things happen that there are good people around, and that good will win if we stick together and we fight together. I think if we're not for advocates, um, we couldn't do a lot of the work that needs to be done.
I just want to add to that that the language is key. In our work, I use a lot of inclusive language. So it's we.
Uh-huh.
What do we need in this moment?
Yeah.
Right? Another way of holding and or walking with and accompanying folks, even just in the present moment of holding the weight of all the things. Um, so language is big for me. The other piece is collaboration, encouraging the collaboration between the two, but then also bringing in and adding resources. And sometimes it's just a practice of allowing folks to remember they have access to resources,
Mm-hmm.
um, which has proven to be helpful because sometimes folks are just like, yeah, I forgot about that part because I'm only here.
Uh-huh.
Um, so
Yes, I remember in my earlier days, if I asked people, hey, who wants to have a group? Everyone would go running. It'd be like I just said, hey, I'm letting the lions loose, right? Like everyone would just whoof, gone, like puff of smoke. But if I just started, making a meal in the kitchen, people would start coming in. Ooh, what are you making? Ooh, can I help? And we would just make a meal together and then we would eat it together.
Mhm. If I may share an experience from a long time ago, Gabriela, you reminded me of a dear colleague I had who's unfortunately since passed, um, Marisi Goiti, who was a very tall Argentinian woman who was a union analyst. And she worked at a substance abuse and domestic violence treatment center in San Francisco. And I was asked to come in and supervise when the supervisor suddenly left. And she invited me to see how she worked. And I walked into the group therapy room, and there were no chairs. There were cushions on the floor. And here is the internal voice, the Western trained psychologist saying, why are there no chairs? Um, this is a group for immigrant men, Spanish speaking men. She's going to sit them on the floor. This is not going to work. Right? But fortunately, I remained quiet. And she started playing very soft Andean music. And the men walked in and they sat on the floor. And she had Play Doh in front of them. And she greeted them each, Don Julio, Don Juan, always very respectful. And, these were men who had significant substance abuse issues and had been extremely violent to their spouses and or children. And so I was being very triggered. This is very early in my work in this area. And she said, "Well, today I want you to show our visitor um, what your relationship is to alcohol. We'll be back." And we left the room, and I said, "Do you do this all the time?" And she said, "Yeah." We came back about half an hour later, and it was the most incredible depiction of these men's relationship to alcohol that they had done with Plato. This man, for example, had done a whole dining scene of the family with the drunken man at the head of the table and the bottle on the ground. Um, it took every ounce of self-control to not start crying. And then I remember the famous words of a therapist of mine who said, "Yvette, it's okay to cry as long as you don't cry more than your client." And so we all sat and cried together, and then we laughed together. And it was one of the most transformative learning experiences for me, who I thought I was pretty woke at the time. This is look circa 1979, 80, and realized that I didn't know nothing. That this woman's intuition, as well as her training, knew that to address these very critical issues with these men, talking was not going to do it. It was very, very powerful. And so a lot of the assumptions, my point is, that we have, even when we think we've done a lot of work, we may still have assumptions that actually limit us from doing the work that we can do better if we allow ourselves to really be embodied and connected and trust our intuition.
Thank you. And then we are getting ready to close out our session. I want to open the floor one more time in case there are any closing words that folks want to share before we start our closing. All right. What an incredible session, folks. Thank you, Shaniqua Ford and Dr. Yvette Flores. Thank you, our team at the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, and immense gratitude for all of our interpreters. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. If you would like to review this session, share this session, the recording will be up on our website. Usually goes up about a week or so afterwards. So Carla is going to go ahead, if she hasn't already, and put our survey link in the chat. We would love to hear what about today worked for you, how we did, and what would be helpful for our next session. We will have our next session on the second Tuesday of the month, 2 to 3 p.m. Central. Feel free to check out our website or subscribe to our newsletter so you can be sure to know as the next session registration opens. That should be open later this week. Within the next week or so, we'll also send you a follow-up email with a link to the recording and anything that may have been mentioned. We don't have any slides for these sessions, but anything we may have mentioned, we'll be sure to include in that follow-up email as well. And if folks would like certificates of attendance, that will also be made available after you complete the evaluation. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been so wonderful to share this space and co-create this space with you today. And just thank you for being dedicated in this work. This work is not easy, but it is important. Thank you.
Thank you.